My hands are clean, but I'm about to get them a little dirty. It's interesting to note that every commentator I researched about today's gospel, about today's reading, had the same concept to start with. Welcome back to Mark after 6 weeks with John. John's Bread of Life chapter. You're probably more than ready to come back to the extended story that Mark is telling about Jesus. That John text was hard, and now you don't have to hear it again for 3 years from now, because that's the way our cycles of readings work. So we are back in Mark, and it's so much easier. It makes so much sense, right? I mean, it's about washing our hands. How simple is that? We've all heard it, especially as kids. Did you wash your hands before you sat at the table, young man? I know I heard it. Actually, for me, it was rather annoying. I would get up from the table in a huff, rush off, run my hands underwater, wipe them off of my jeans, come back and sit down at the table, and then, what's the next line? Did you use soap? You do not get to eat until those hands are clean. Now go off and wash them properly. Of course, I didn't get it much until around the age of 15 when I started working in nursing homes and then in group homes, where you're taking care of those who are very vulnerable to disease, and where disease sometimes is rampant because of the lack of cleanliness in facilities or just the lack of cleanliness of a certain person. You learn to wash your hands constantly and bug somebody else to wash their hands as well. I very quickly became my parents when I was working in group homes. Did you wash your hands before you sat down at this table? But that can't surely be what's going on in this passage, can it? An argument about washing hands before eating that has probably been repeated in each and every one of our homes? Yes and no. Yes, it really is about the practice of washing hands. No, as often is true in such arguments, there is more going on underneath the surface than initially meets the eye. With our kids, maybe they just forgot. Or maybe they decided, even though mom and dad think that washing hand thing is important, they don't. And while they're at it, maybe they're tired of a few other rules as well. So maybe not washing their hands, in this case, is less about forgetfulness and more about testing their parents' authority. A very similar thing is happening here. The Pharisees are all getting in a huff because the disciples are not following tradition. Why don't you follow the tradition of the elders? Their tradition and the tradition and law must be upheld equally. How can Jesus' authority usurp the law and tradition? And at this point, it's nearly crucial to put back in the verses that are missing from here. In case you notice, Chris is pointing out that we're only reading certain verses, and there's a whole section that's missing. You see, because it's not simply about authority, but authority linked to behavior. Our everyday, ordinary decisions about how we treat each other. Which is why Jesus throws the tradition of the elders thing back in their faces. You want to talk about tradition, Jesus asked, and let's talk about tradition. And make that a commandment of honoring our parents. That's the part that was left out. Seems pretty straightforward to me, and yet you've found a religious loophole by which you can declare your wealth and offering to God, and thereby not share it with your elderly parents. Jesus knows, of course, that when the scribes and Pharisees ask why some of the disciples do not wash their hands, the question is not an innocent one. It's meant to indict Jesus, asking why some of his followers do not live according to the elders' traditions. It's accusing Jesus of not following the law himself, of acting as if he believes himself to be above the law. But knowing this, Jesus responds with Isaiah 7:6-7. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus calls them hypocrites because they abandon the command of God and to overholding human tradition. This reproach, this accusation is more than a condemnation of empty worship practices. It's a condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees and the way they have distorted the tradition in order to circumvent the law. Jesus is not rejecting the law. In fact, he is rebuking them for their failure to uphold it. Mark 7, 9 through 13, which are not part of the lectionary today, clarify this point. Jesus condemns the scribes and the Pharisees for use of korban, a practice of willing the assets to the temple. Assets that may no longer be used for the families, including elderly parents, especially elderly parents' care. In such a practice, Jesus asserts violates the commandment to honor your father and mother. So what the Pharisees and scribes are doing is taking their money, willing it to the temple, and then the temple is paying them, the temple is supporting them, but they don't have to give anything to their parents. The scribes and Pharisees are allowing people to circumvent the law and legal imperative to care for their parents through the use of this practice, thus making void the word of God through your tradition. To me, what I'm hearing is, you don't get to pick and choose how or if you will follow, quote, the law. And especially you don't take tradition over the law. You see, the question raised by the Pharisees is apparently a sincere one in their minds. And the narrator tells us why this is. Ritual purity is an essential dimension of the Pharisaic religion. An effort to claim Jewish identity in a world that is much happier with a polytheistic style. See, the Pharisees argued that the practice of eating with undefiled hands was an obligation imposed not on just the temple priests only, but on all the Jewish people who sought to be the holy nation that they had been called to be. To heed a stipulation of the oral law, the tradition of the elders, was not to escape into trivialities, but to demonstrate how seriously the law of God is to be taken. Therefore, you don't get to do one without doing the other. But in reality, these purity codes were basically traditions used to say who was in and who was out. Who are the proud members of the Jewish faith? They are the ones who perform outward signs. They are the ones that belong, so all who observe them know that they are just and good and faithful practicers of their faith. But where the Pharisees missed the boat was the opportunity to care for the elderly, to care for the sick and the widows. Basically, they were picking and choosing which purity codes to follow, which tradition to follow. And one commenter says it raised some interesting questions. He says, quote, Jesus is challenging them as to how their traditions contribute to them fulfilling their mission. And I think this is just where this week's sermon might bring this odd passage to bear on our shared life. The commentator goes on, I mean, maybe we don't seem at first blush quite as fussy about tradition as Jesus' opponents did. But if what we're to do, like suggest tinkering with some of our own traditions, perhaps changing the worship in order to make worship more understandable and accessible to a younger generation. Or what if you were to drop the lectionary in favor of moving through a narrative of the Bible? Or what if you were to cancel all committees in favor of a more nimble way of governing the congregation? That one's a little scary to me. Or he says, or what if you were to suggest getting rid of pews to make the sanctuary space more flexible so you could offer to more community groups? Or what if each fourth Sunday folks didn't go to church at all, but rather engaged in community service throughout your county? Or what if? You probably get the idea. We each have traditions that are more than traditions. They're probably more like sacred cows. They are markers of what has been accepted as right and wrong. And therefore, they lend us a sense of stability. Never mind that our traditions do in fact change over time. I mean, after all, we are speaking English in the church. There was a time that was forbidden. This passage serves both to revitalize our traditions and explore what we really should hold as sacred, while also pushing us to the far more important concern of the law to help us care for each other. The broader context into which this interchange between Jesus and the Pharisees occurs presents an interesting backdrop. On the one hand, there are two generous feedings of the hungry, the multitudes. An extravagant summary of Jesus' healing in and around Gennesaret. They pose a sharp contrast to the restrictive issues of washing the hands before eating. And then on the other hand, the interchange of the Pharisees is followed by the stories of the persistent faith of the Gentile woman, a Syrophoenician, who asks only for crumbs, and her daughter is healed. And then the restoration of the hearing and the speech of a deaf man living in a Gentile area of Decapolis. It is as if Jesus' critique of the kosher laws, quote, thus he declared all food clean, is then documented by healing of those non-Jewish people. It's not what we put in our bodies, but what comes out of our hearts, what comes out of our lips. Proclaiming that the kingdom of God belonged only to the Jewish people, who followed only certain rules and regulations, as opposed to offering peace, healing, food, welcome to those beyond their borders, was what was wrong. You can keep your tradition as long as they are not interfering with the work of God's kingdom here on earth. Letting people know that they are loved and welcome and cared for isn't always easy. Sometimes it contradicts our own traditions, quote unquote. We are called as Christians to grow, study, learn. And as a result of doing that, what have we become? As a United Church of Christ, what have we become? We just celebrated a woman who passed, and I can't think of her name right now, but she was one of the first ordained women in the United Church of Christ. We are an open and affirming congregation in the United Church of Christ, a designation for congregations, campus ministries, and other bodies in the UCC, which make a public covenant of welcome into their life and ministry to persons of all sexual orientations and genders and identity and expressions. 50 years ago, you probably wouldn't have heard that. We have an immigrant welcoming congregations. In a world becoming increasingly globalized, more people are leaving their homelands, seeking better lives and opportunity in new countries. Their reasons for leaving are diverse as complex: economic necessity, war, persecution. Yet we've been a nation of welcoming immigrants, and so we are a church that welcomes immigrants as a denomination. We gratefully welcome immigrants and their contributions, and we fight against the exclusion, discrimination against them. As Christians, we are called to love our neighbor. The Bible is firm in calling us to welcome aliens and strangers in our land and to love them as we love ourselves. And this time, we need to listen to the voice of the still speaking God. We will learn how to respond to these new sisters and brothers residing among us. We are an earth justice denomination. Since we are about to enter the season of creation, oh, by the way, that's 4 weeks outside of the lectionary, where we focus on our earth. Yesterday was a day of prayer, International Day of Prayer for the earth itself. Next Saturday, a group of United Church of Christ people, along with UUs and other denominations, are gathering for a march for a rise for climate, jobs, and justice. And we're all marching in San Francisco. There are videos online that talk about why we march and about our need for earth care. And I found this one, so I want to just share this 3-minute video with you before I conclude.
What motivates us as Christians to seek justice, to create a What motivates us as Christians to seek justice, to create a better world for ourselves and future generations? We're driven by three great loves: love of children,
of neighbors,
of God's creation.
as parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, we must be mindful of the kind of future we are creating for our children. One of the greatest things we can leave behind is a healthy, safe, and vibrant world that allows future generations to thrive.
God commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Where we see injustice, we have to act. Disadvantaged communities bear the heaviest impacts of pollution, and it's our duty as people of faith to fight for them.
God has entrusted creation to us. By creation, we are speaking of the mountains, the rivers, the beautiful majesty of what God has created. We may not all agree on what is causing climate change, but we all agree that we must do something about climate change and turn love into action.
Everyone deserves clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. But at public environmental hearings in my home state of North Carolina, I've heard firsthand stories of folks who can't drink or cook or bathe in their water because of coal ash contamination from their local power plants. That experience inspired me to help form the Creation Justice Network, which advocates on behalf of communities within the Southern Conference of the United Church of Christ. Together, our collective voices can be a powerful tool to influence the course of justice.
We have the power to let our grandchildren experience the Eden into which we were born by embracing clean energy and cutting carbon pollution. By recycling, reducing waste, and adding green spaces, we can create a healthier, more equitable world for everyone.
At Trinity United Church of Christ, we are creating a green infrastructure. Our church has a green roof now. The floor I'm standing on is a green floor. We have an organic garden where young people are learning about science.
Every United Church of Christ church and congregation in the country can be making a difference on climate. Our UCC Creation Justice Churches program helps our congregations make creation care and climate equity an integral part of their mission and engage the community on solutions.
The United Church of Christ is also partnering with Blessed Tomorrow, a multi-faith program designed to amplify faith leadership on climate change. Together, we can increase our impact and make climate action a priority for all of our congregations. We're doing it for our children and grandchildren and all who follow us.
We're doing it for our communities.
We don't say by any means necessary. We say by any greens necessary.
Join all of us in the United Church of Christ in building solutions that will help create a thriving and just world for all. Visit the UCC website or Blessed Tomorrow and find out how you can lead your congregation and your community to action.
Strive to be a place of welcome, education, and partnership. And as we seek to mirror the kingdom of God here on earth, we need to look at our better ways and better practices of just caring for the earth around us, especially our water and our air. All of us who live here know how bad the air can get, especially after the fires. And my eyes still water and my throat still scratches, depending what day it is. But we have opportunities, including the march this Saturday, and I just want you to think about maybe ways that we can better engage and better practices that we can engage. May these words find a resting place in your heart, and may the Spirit of God inspire you to seek out better ways to be a green church and a welcoming community. Amen.